So in Screencast 3, we are going to look at a model which is a little more recognisable to traditional economics. Our pyramid model was very much based around the structure of the sport industry. And the way we divided down the structure, we looked at elite sport and participation sport. In the face-to-face sessions this week, you're going to look at a slightly more sophisticated model, and you're going to try to, for a chosen sport, fill in some of the players within that model and look at the way that money flows around that sport. But in Screencast 3, I want to look at a model which is more recognisable to the formal study of economics, rather than just thinking about the sport industry. But then I want to discuss how normal models which look at the economy and flows of income around the economy do not take account of some of the complexities of the sport industry. So, this book is taken from Chris Grattan and Peter Taylor's book, Economics of Sport and Recreation. You'll find it on page 15. It's available as an online book in the on the library catalogue, and it's recommended reading for this week's lecture as well. So, economists will usually produce a kind of a diagram like this, which looks at the circulation of revenue, income with an expenditure within the economy. So they start off with a really simple model like this, which looks at producers, firms, or the formal production sector of the economy, and households, which is made up of individuals and families and groups of people who, have incomes, money, and time that they look to spend, right? So there is a circular relationship between households and the formal production sector. So if we think about the sport industry in this way, then households sell their labour to the formal production sector. So firms, businesses, households provide the labour. They work, they sell their labour, right? Okay. And they receive money, wages back. They in turn then spend money in or on products which are produced by the formal production sector. Okay. So what we can see here in the formal economy is that there is the relationship between households, right, and formal production, right? Households provide labour, it's kind of labour, land, capital, but in terms of the sport economy, they provide their labour and in return they buy goods, yeah? Okay, so they receive money, wages from the formal production, and they make money payments in the forms of goods to the formal production economy. So people are employed and spend their money, and that supports the economy, but they need jobs to generate wages. So we've got this kind of circular flow of money around the economy. So that's quite easy to understand. This model does have some problems in all economies anyway, because it just assumes this kind of constant circulation, right? And Grattan and Taylor, when they talk about this, and economists sometimes talk about this as understanding a central heating system. So in a central heating system, you've got the same amount of water which is pumped around, hot round your radiators, and it just circulates continually. And unless you've got leaks in your system or in your pipes, it doesn't actually, that the amount of money doesn't increase or decrease. Well, what we've seen is that the size of the economy and the size of the sport economy does increase and decrease. So one of the problems with this model is that it doesn't look at sources of injections into the economy. So injections can be, if the government decides to increase funding into sport, that increases the amount of money circulating in the sport economy. If there is a major event like the Olympics, that increases the amount of money which is injected into the sport economy. There are also leaks out of the sport economy. So if households, consumers decide to spend their money on sports goods which are produced outside this economy, so if we're thinking here of this economy being the UK sports economy, and as an example, New Balance manufactures some of its goods still in the UK, but Nike and Adidas don't, then anybody who decides to buy a pair of shoes made outside of the UK, that money leaks out of the UK sport economy into the German sport economy in the case of Adidas and their gross national product, or the US economy in the case of Nike. So this doesn't allow for leakages out of the economy and injections into the economy. So it ignores an important part of the overall sport economy. So that's one of the problems with this model. And also, this model just looks at money and goods. It puts a monetary value on labour. Now, not all labour is paid. And in the sports sector, we have an informal economy. Okay. So the informal economy are those volunteers in the sport industry who work, but they do not receive payment for their labour. So this is a kind of slightly updated model, which shows that households still sell their labour and receive money wages back. So there's a relationship here between households and the formal production sector. And we see that, that households then make money payments, spend money, consumer spending, consumer expenditure on goods and services produced in the formal production sector and receive services back. Okay, now, over here we've got the informal production sector. And in this diagram, this is the voluntary sector in sport. Now, what we can see here is that the voluntary sector in sports, if we think about a rugby club or a cricket club, it has a clubhouse, and in the clubhouse it has a bar. So in the kind of leisure industry more broadly, it makes payments to breweries and suppliers of drinks and food and snacks, which it sells in its bar, and they are supplied back. Okay, so there is a degree of kind of participation by the voluntary sector, the informal economy, in the formal economy. But the main input into the voluntary sector in sport is labour, which volunteers. So if any of you volunteer to coach or help at a university sports club or your old sports club, then you will know that a lot of the labour, the majority of the labour that happens is supplied by households, but it is not actually paid for. Yeah, it doesn't receive payment. What it does is it provides a service back to individuals and households. So instead of a paid for service, it provides an opportunity to participate. Yeah, but it is derived from and generated by the chief input here, which is unpaid labour. So informal production in sport is really important. And we will come on in future weeks to look at what's called the household production method. And this is really that consumers have a choice to buy goods and services purely in the formal economy, right? Or they can use some goods and services which are bought in the formal economy, but combine them with their own labour to produce their own sport activity, their own leisure activity. So a really easy example is, if I go running, I need to buy a pair of running shoes, right, and a pair of shorts, but I don't then pay anybody to train me to run. I don't pay for a facility to run in. I do that myself, yeah? Equally kind of, you can take that for a lot of the kind of informal or semi-formal sports participation which happens in parks, which are free to use, or in the countryside, which is free to use. You buy some goods in the formal economy, but then through your own kind of organisation, whether it's a kickabout or a pick-up game of basketball or a kickabout game of football in the park, rather than going to Goals Soccer Centre or an indoor or outdoor pitch where you pay for a surface and floodlights, you're kind of doing this yourself. It's very much the same as the decision to cook a meal or eat out at a restaurant, right? And some of it is the trade-off of time that you have against increased leisure time. But a number of people in the voluntary sector decide to sacrifice substantial amounts of their non-paid leisure time to support the voluntary sector. So this model, particularly for sport, because sport has a large voluntary informal element to it, this traditional model does not really reflect the way that sport operates. Now, this is significant because this kind of model is what is used by economists using what's called the National Income Accounting Framework to calculate the economic value of sport, right? The National Income Accounting Framework, because there's no exchange of money here, doesn't pick up the value of voluntary sector sport in the economy. So the figures that we looked at previously, calculated by CIRC and other organisations which use this National Income Accounting Framework, they do a great job. It's meticulous, I would say tedious and difficult to actually do, but that method actually undervalues the sport economy, because down here we've got the informal production, and you've got kind of goods which are traded in a kind of informal, non-market, non-exchange process or non-financial exchange process. It's done in a different way. So the voluntary sector in sport is significant. It's also rather difficult to calculate its value, right? So the last figures that we have were generated by Peter Taylor, so, Emeritus Professor of Sport Economics at Sheffield Hallam University. And Peter's research in 2002 found that if we added up, so based on surveys of volunteers and number of hours which were done, that was equivalent to 720 additional full-time workers in sport, right? Or more than 1.5 times equivalent the number of paid labour force in the sport industry in 2001, okay? And that these volunteers contributed an estimated 1.2 billion hours of volunteering in 2002. Now, if we take the average hourly wage in 2002, which was £11 something, I think £11.62, and we apply it to those 1.2 billion hours, this gives us a kind of proxy for the value of this voluntary labour in the sport industry, right? And the value that was put on volunteering hours in 2002 was over £14 billion. So if we're putting a total value on the value of the sport industry and the sport economy, we need to look at activity in the informal economy and add that to the £25 billion that we already have in 27-18 in England. Now, even just using 2002 figures, and we know that they will have escalated, volunteering, I think, has increased, and the rate of pay will has increased. We're probably looking at something well into the mid £40 billion as the total value. Yeah. So what we're talking about is volunteering hours are probably worth nearly as much as the portion of sport that happens in the formal economy, which, as we've seen, is valued at £25 billion in England. Right. So my guess is that if this study was redone, we would be pushing up to the high teens, which is getting close to the £25 billion of value that happens in the formal economy. Okay, so what are the implications of some of this? Well, circular flows in the formal economy ignore, as we've just seen, the contribution of the informal economy. And the informal economy can be thought of as the voluntary sector. The informal economy in some other areas can be thought of as the black economy. So people who work, but they work off the books because they don't want to pay tax. Yeah. The black economy is also counterfeit goods. And we know that there are counterfeit sports goods, and in some markets in the world, counterfeit Nike and Adidas is a significant issue. But largely in the UK and in Europe and in most advanced economies, the informal economy in sport can be thought of as the voluntary sector rather than the black market. Now, concentrating only on the formal economy, where money exchanges hands for labour, goods and services, ignores the economic contribution of the voluntary sector. And this also leads me on to another point, which I'll be making in next week's lecture, is that it draws our attention to the fact that the value of other non-market activity, right? So if you participate in sport, you make health savings in the sport economy, you contribute to greater production at work because you take less days off sick, etc., etc. All of that value which is related to sport is not captured by the circular flows argument. So the £25 billion in the economy, which we can capture through the National Income Accounting Framework, which looks at flows of income, revenue, expenditure in the sport economy, misses a huge amount of activity and value in the voluntary sector, but also interactions in the health and the education and the policing and the crime and justice sector. And this is something, and it can make savings in those areas, economic contributions in those areas. And this is something that we will come on to in coming weeks and next week when we look at government intervention in sport, a rationale for government intervention in sport, and the social return on investment framework, which CIRC have also pioneered. And incidentally, alongside the report that I've referred you to this week, they've also completed a social return on investment estimation of the value of sport, which dwarfs the value of £25 billion, which is made in the formal economy. Okay, so that's the end of Screencast 3. And in Screencast 4, I want to come and talk about some of the characteristics of sport as an activity, which will link us back to some of the concepts or some of the concluding comments I made at the end of Screencast 3 around sport's contribution in other areas of the economy and why sport is a different kind of good or service than normal consumer goods